B'siyata d'shmai, we're going to learn Sukkah Daf Lamed Zayin. We're going to start from the Mishnah approximately in the middle of Daf Lamed Vav Omid Beis. Says the Mishnah, Ein oigdin es halulav elo b'minoi. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. We know there's a halacha, there's actually a machlokes whether there's a chiyuv, whether it's essential to tie the lulav with adasim and aravos, or if it's just preferable, it's just a mitzvah. But Rabbi Yehuda says that when one ties the lulav, it must be tied only with one of the species of the lulav, which is either a lulav or hadassim or aravos. One of the species. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Reb Meir Omer. Reb Meir argues and says, Afilu b'chut b'meshicha, even with a thread of linen, you're allowed to tie the lulav with hadassim and aravos. Omer Reb Meir. Reb Meir wants to prove his point, and he says, Ma'aseh be'anshei Yerushalayim, the people in Yerushalayim, there was an incident, shahayu oigdin es lulavim, they would tie their lulav be'gemoiniyos shel zav, with fibers of gold, with thin threads of gold. And even though gold is not one of the minim, one of the four species, nonetheless they would do that. Amruloi, the Chachamim said back to Reb Meir, B'minoi hoyu oigdin oisa milamata, that they were not actually using the gold in order to do the igud, to tie the lulav together, because as the Chachamim hold that you have to do the igud with one of the minim of the lulav, and the gold, since it's not used for an igud, for an essential part of the mitzvah, it's only used for a noi, to beautify the mitzvah. And anything which is there to beautify the mitzvah is not considered as taking an extra an extra species, and it's just as a beautification in its own right, and therefore it is okay. Says the Gemara, Omar Rava. Rava says, Afilu b'siv, afilu be'ikra dedikla. Even though Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah says that you have to use one of the species, but it doesn't mean you have to actually use let's use a lulav for an example. It doesn't mean you have to use a lulav leaf to tie the lulav, but you can even use other parts of the date palm, which is the lulav tree is a date palm. You're allowed to use the other parts as well for the igud, because it's the same species, and this includes even the siv, which is the palm vine, and afilu be'ikra dedikla, if you would peel off some of the trunk of the tree and use that to tie the lulav together, then it's okay. Omar Rava, my Talmud Rabbi Yehuda. Rava is explaining, what's the reasoning behind Rabbi Yehuda that the igud has to be done with minoi, with one of the species of the lulav? Kosova lulav tzarich eget, because he holds that lulav needs, it's an essential that one ties the lulav with the hadassim and aravos. V'imaisa min achrin, and if you're going to bring a different species, then have a chamisha mini. Then you've got 5 species. You're holding 5 species. You're holding, because the igud, the tying, is an essential part of the mitzvah, we view it as we give significance to what it actually is. And if it's a different species, then you're taking 5 species, and that's Bal Tosef. The Torah says you're not allowed to add onto the dimensions or onto the halachas of the Torah. V'omar Rava, minoa minelo desiv ve'ikra dedikla mina delulvahu. So now Rava says that, what's my source? Because Rava said a minute ago at the beginning of the Gemara that you don't actually have to use the lulav leaves for the igud. You can use the palm vine or the trunk of the lulav tree. Where would I know that they're also included in lulav, in that same bracket? The Tanya, because we learned in a brisa, Basukais Teishu. The pasuk says in the Chumash, Basukais Teishu Shivas Yomim, you should sit in sukkahs. What does that mean? The word sukkahs is in plural. Sukkah shall kol dover v'dover, sukkah that has any type of schach on it. It doesn't matter what you put as the schach, as long as it's psal, as long as it's psoilis ger and v'yekev, as long as it conforms with the halachas we've learned earlier on in the Masechet. It doesn't matter which species you're using. Divrei Reb Meir, that's the opinion of Reb Meir. Rabbi Yehuda argues and says, Ein sukkah neheges elo b'daled minim shebelulav. That only that you could to use for schach, for a sukkah, you have to use one of the 4 species of a lulav. Vadin naisen, and I have a kal v'chomer to prove that schach has to be from one of the 4 species of the lulav. Uma lulav, because lulav is inferior to sukkah. Sukkah's got a certain superior quality to it, a certain chumrah, a certain stringency that lulav doesn't have. And therefore we assume that any stringencies that lulav had would certainly apply to sukkah. What is this? Uma lulav. She'ein noeg baleilos kebiyomim. Lulav is, so to speak, inferior to sukkah because it's only a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah that you only do in the day, not at night. Eino noeg elo ba'arba saminim. And nonetheless, even though it's an inferior type of mitzvah, so to speak, because it's only done in the day, it is restricted to 4 species. Sukkah, so the sukkah, the more stringent type of mitzvah, sheneheges baleilos kebiyomim. Not only is there mitzvah to be in the sukkah in the day, also in the night. Eino din sheloitei elo ba'arba saminim. Can we not take it for granted that you have to be restricted to the 4 species of lulav for using the schach on the sukkah? Amrulai, the Reb Meir, the Chachamim, answered to Rabbi Yehuda and said it's not a kal v'chomer. Kol din she'atadon tchilosei lehachmir v'soifei lehokel. Any type of kal v'chomer like this, where there's a stringency in sukkah. Sukkah says, I want you to make sure that you're in the sukkah, not just in the day, also in the night. That stringency really is telling us, make sure to do everything you can to make it possible to be in the sukkah. Not only in the day, also in the night. But do everything you can to be able to be in the sukkah as much as possible. And that is telling us, don't restrict the materials you can use for schach, because if you restrict the materials you use for schach, then okay, I've missed out 2 words. It's not a kal v'chomer. Why? Because if you're going to restrict using the schach just to 4 species, if you're not going to find the 4 species or one of the 4 species, as Rashi says, for the schach, you won't be able to keep the mitzvah of sukkah. And the stringency of sukkah is there to tell us, make it, or the Torah is telling us that it's as easy as possible to use schach and to find schach. You don't need to restrict it to the 4 species. Which is, so the kal v'chomer, the chumrah of sukkah, is telling us, don't use this kal v'chomer to restrict the schach to just 4 minim. Sukkah shel kol davar. The Torah says that you can use any type of schach for schach of a sukkah. And this is the way I explained it, is the way Rabbi Akiva Eiger explains it in one of his tshuvas. That's the way to understand this Gemara, so it should not conflict with other places in Shas. V'chein be'Ezra, we find a similar concept we find by Ezra, where we're going to now see an explicit pasuk that says you're allowed to use anything for a sukkah, for schach, even if it's not one of the 4 species. Because by Ezra, in Sefer Nehemiah, which is sometimes called Ezra in the Gemara, in Sefer Nehemiah Perek Ches, it says as follows. Omer, he said, V'asher yashmiu v'yaviru koil b'chol oreim u'b'Yerushalayim leimer tza'u hahor. Go out to the mountain, v'haviu elai, and bring to me. Ale v'haviu, and to bring. Ale zayis, bring the leaves of a zayis, an olive tree. V'ale eitz shemen, and the leaves of an afarsamoin tree. V'ale, both of those are not of the 4 species of the lulav. V'ale hadas, and the leaves of a hadas bush, a type of hadas which is not kosher for the 3 minim, because the leaves, it's called the hadas shlita. We've learnt about it, when the leaves are not protruding from the stem at the same level, that's called ale hadas. V'ale tmorim, or the leaves of the branches, the leaves of a date palm, which is the lulav tree. V'ale eitz ovois, or the leaves of a bush of kosher hadasim. Lastei sukkos, in order to use them for the schach kakosov, as it says in the pasuk. So what do we see from this pasuk? That besides for using the hadas and the lulav for the sukkah, you also use the olive tree and the afarsamoin tree. And those are not the species of those are not of the arba minim. So you see clearly in this pasuk, not like we saw before, not like Rabbi Yehuda said, that ein sukkah neheges elo b'dalet minim shebelulav. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda Savar, Rabbi Yehuda will answer this and say that Hani ledefanis, that when in the pasuk in Nehemiah, when Ezra said that you should bring these species for the sukkah, it wasn't for the schach, it was for the walls, and for the walls indeed there's no restrictions. Ale hadas, v'ale tmorim, v'ale eitz avos is l'schach, they are used for schach. And now Rava concludes his proof that Rava said that Rabbi Yehuda can even use sieve and ikra dedikla, and Rava proved that because we just brought a brayso that Rabbi Yehuda says you have to use one of the species of the arba minim for schach. Utnana, we learned in a Mishnah on Daf Yudalad Amud Aleph, Masachin ben Asarim divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says you're allowed to use planks, boards of wood as schach. Now it cannot be boards of any other tree because Rabbi Yehuda says you have to use one of the species. So it must be a boards used from the lulav tree. Alma, you see from here that siv, ikra dedikla, that even the parts of the date palm, the parts of that tree which is not the lulav itself, are also kosher to be used for schach. So we see that mina de lulvahu, it's included in the species of lulav, shma mina. So that's proof to what Rava said before, that according to Rabbi Yehuda, one can even use siv and ikra dedikla for the schach. So asks the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda, now we're going back to what we saw in the brayso that Rabbi Yehuda said, the arba minim in midi achrin eloi. Can it really be that Rabbi Yehuda says you have to use one of the 4 species for schach, or all the 4, or one of the 4 for the schach, and any species, any type of schach which is not one of the arba minim is not kosher for schach? Vatani, we learned in the brayso on Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis, sichacha ben asorim shel erez, and erez normally means a cedar wood, which is not one of the arba minim. That if somebody were to use the boards, planks of cedar wood for schach, sheyesh ben arba tfachim divrei hakel psula. If they are 4 tfachim wide, everybody says they're possible, and we learnt about this at length on Daf Yud Zayin with Gzeras Tikra, and we're not going into that sugya again now. Then if it's 4 tfachim wide, it's possible. Ein be'em arba tfachim, if they are between 3 and 4 tfachim wide, Reb Meir poisel, Reb Yehuda machshir. And then there's a machlokes. Reb Yehuda says it's kosher, Reb Meir says it's possible. And we're not going now again into what the machlokes between them is, but Reb Yehuda says it's kosher. Reb Meir, and by the way, the Gemara mentions at the end of the brayso, Reb Meir agrees shem yesh bein neser leneser k'maloi neser, that if between each plank, which of the cedar wood, there's shemaniach psal benem, if you put kosher schach between the 2 apostle planks, uksheira, then it will be kosher. And again, for details and understanding of that, we need to revert back to the previous sugyas on Daf Yud Zayin. But what do we see from here? We see clearly that according to Rabbi Yehuda, then one is allowed to use, provided that they're not too wide, one's allowed to use nesorim shel erez, cedar planks for schach. Did Rabbi Yehuda not say in the brayso that schach has to be one of the 4 minim? Answers the Gemara, you're right that erez normally means cedar wood. However, that my erez, in this case, erez actually means to hados. It means a hadassim tree is called erez. Rabbi bar Avuna, and this we see this from Rabbi bar Avuna. The Omar Rabbi bar Avuna, Omri Beirav, they said in the Beis Medrash of Rav, Asara mine arozim hein. There are 10 different types of woods which are called erez. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk in Yeshaya, and the pasuk actually only mentions 7 of them. But the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah Daf Chav Gimel explains what the other 3 are, and it says in the pasuk, Etein bamidbar erez 1 shita 2 vahadas 3 ve'etz shemen 4 osim ba'arava beroish 5 tidhar 6 va'ashur Ashur Yachtov is 7. So you see there that Hadas is one of those that are considered erez. And that's what the Gemara brings here. The pasuk, the beginning of the pasuk, Etin bamidbar erez v'hadas, actually says erez shita v'hadas. So you see that Hadas is called an erez. And that's what it means when the Mishnah said before, that on the brayso said in Daf Yud Zayin, that according to Rabbi Yehuda, you're allowed to use nesorim shel erez. It doesn't mean regular erez as in cedar wood, it means the hadas tree, and that complies with what Rabbi Yehuda said, that the schach has to be one of the species of the lulav. Continues the Gemara, Reb Meir oimer afilu b'mashisa chulu. We saw in the Mishnah, Reb Meir says that they would even tie the lulav with threads of linen, which are clearly not one of the minim, one of the species of the lulav. Tanya, we saw in a brayso, and a Tisefta Omer Reb Meir, Maisa b'yakire Yerushalayim. In the Mishnah, Reb Meir mentioned this in the name of Anshe Yerushalayim, the people of Yerushalayim. Here in this brayso, it quotes the Yakire Yerushalayim, the prominent and important people of Yerushalayim. Shal yoigdim es lulavim, they would tie their lulavim b'gimoini shel zav, and we saw this in the Mishnah with threads of with fibers of gold. And Omru Loi, the Chachamim said to Reb Meir, Misham Raya, don't bring proof from there that you can use anything for the igud, because b'minoi hayu oigdin oisim milamata, they would fulfill the requirement of igud with something else. Those Anshe Yerushalayim would use one of the 4 species to actually tie the lulav with the hadassim and aravas. They merely put on this gold to beautify the mitzvah. Anything that's done to beautify the mitzvah is not considered an extra mean. It's not considered as taking a 5th type of a fifth species, and therefore there's no problem of Bal Tosef, and therefore there's no proof from the Yakirei Yerushalayim against Reb Yehuda. Continues the Gemara, Omaluhu Rabba lahanim megadle hishana de beiresh gelusa. Rabba said to those who were fixing and preparing the lulav, megadle means to fix, hishana is the lulav, de beiresh gelusa of the head of the galus. Ki gadliso hishana de beiresh gelusa, when you prepare the lulav of the resh gelusa, shairi bay, make sure that under the eged that you leave a space. Beis yad is a handle somewhere for the hands to be able to hold the lulav directly without the eged being in between and separating between the bare hands and the lulav. In order there should not be a separation between the hands of the resh gelusa and the lulav. And over here the Rashi explains that Rabbah holds that, and we're talking about that you did the igud with one of the species of the lulav. There's no problem here of Bal Tosef or anything like that. That's not the issue here. He's using the same species. However, he holds that lulav ain't tzorich eged. The lulav does not need to be tied. It's not essential. Since it's not essential, then the tying actually acts as a separation between the hand and the lulav. And we're going to see later on Amud Beis that Rabbi himself holds that even though the igud is the same as one of the species that he's holding, min b'minoi chaytzitz, according to Rabbah, it serves as a chatzitza. And therefore, Rabbah told these people, make sure the space underneath the eged in order to hold the lulav directly, not via the igud. Rava argued and said, no, since they did the igud in order to beautify the lulav, and anything which is there to beautify the lulav is not considered a chatzitza. Continues the Gemara of Omar Rabbah. When a person takes the lulav, he should not wrap a scarf around his hand and that way take the lulav. Because it says velokachtem, and we've already seen lokachtem means velokach. It has to be a whole taking. A whole taking means that there's no separation between the hand and what you're taking. Veleka, and if you'd have a scarf wrapped around your hand, then you're not having a complete taking. You're not directly taking the lulav. Rava argues and says, Lekicha alidei dava acher shmo lekicha. Lekicha means that you are taking, your hand is taking something. If there's something in between your hand and what you're taking, that's also called your hand is taking it. It's called that my hand is taking it via something else. It's lekicha alidei dava acher. That's also considered a lekicha. Omar Rava. And Rava says, you want to know proof, the lekicha alidei dava acher, shmo lekicha, that it's called the lekicha. I'll bring you proof from a Mishnah that none we learned a Mishnah in Perikut base of Masechet Poro. It says in the Mishnah, Ezoiv Kotzor, what happens? The way they used to sprinkle the water with the ashes of the Pora Aduma onto either people or utensils that were Tommy mace, they would dip the Ezoiv, these grasses, into the tube, into a shveiferes, into a tube that's containing this water, and then they would sprinkle onto whatever needs sprinkling. What happens if the grass that is using the azov is too short and you cannot, when you put it into the top of the tube of the shveiferes, it doesn't reach the water? Mesapko, you can lengthen the grasses, so to speak, bechut, either with a thread or bekush or with a spindle, v'toivel, and that way the grass will reach the bottom of the tube where the water is. Umayla, and you would raise up the grass that now has the water on it. And then he will actually hold not the thread or the spindle, he'll actually hold the azov itself. Umazeh, and sprinkle on whatever needs sprinkling on those utensils. And so that's what it says in the Mishnah. So Amai, why would you be able to lengthen the grass, so to speak, with something that's not grass, with either a thread or with a spindle? Says the Gemara. The Gemara is asking, because it says in the Pasuk, V'lokach ezoiv, you should take the ezoiv, v'toval b'mayim, and dip it into the water. So it says that you have to take the ezoiv when you're dipping it. This is called taking the ezoiv. You're not holding the ezoiv. Omar Achmona, the Torah says v'lokach v'toval. Elolav, says Rava, it must be that Shema Mino. I have proof from here that lekicha lidei dava achir shmo lekicha. Even though it says v'lokach ezoiv, you have to take the grass. Since I'm taking it via something else, the thread or the spindle, it's also considered v'lokach, and therefore it's okay. That was Rava's proof that lekicha lidei dava achir shmo lekicha. You'll ask me, if lekicha lidei dava acher shmo lekicha, why then, when I take the ezoiv out of this tube, why do I need to then grab hold of the ezoiv itself? Why can I not sprinkle it whilst holding the thread or the spindle? So Rashi addresses that, and Rashi says because you're trying to aim at the utensils, and if you're going to have these grasses held on a string and you're going to try and sprinkle, you're not going to aim. The water is not going to reach its target, and therefore it's just common sense, technically, hold the grass, and that way you'll be able to sprinkle and reach where you have to reach. Says the Gemara, Mimai, maybe that's not a good proof that lekicha lidei dava acher shmo lekicha. Maybe there is different. Given the chobrei kagufei domi over there, he actually knotted it. He tied the spindle or the thread to the grass. If you tie something, then it's considered as one. It's considered as if I took the grass. It's not considered as if I took the thread and the thread is holding the grass. Lekicha lidei davar acher. No, it's considered, or it might be called lekicha lidei davar acher, but it's a type of lekicha lidei davar acher that the thing I'm taking and that davar acher with which I'm taking it have been bound into one. It's been tied. Maybe over there it suffices and it's called a lekicha. But over here, when a person has a scarf round his hand, he's not tying the scarf to the lulav. If he were to tie the scarf to the lulav, then indeed it would be the same as that Mishnah. But you're not tying the scarf to the lulav, the scarf is tied around your hand. And therefore, maybe in that case, everybody would agree that lekicha lidei dava acher is not called a lekicha, and therefore Rava has no proof from that Mishnah. Elo mehacha, Rava brings a different proof from a different source that lekicha lidei dava acher is called a lekicha even if it's not tied. And this is from another Mishnah in Masechet Sukkah in Perek Vav. It says there that the ashes of the parah aduma would be stored in a tube, also in a tube, and when they would come then to the trough, which was full of water, special water, Maim Chaim, whatever waters they used for the parah aduma, they would then pour the ashes out of this tube into the trough, mix it together, and that would be the waters of the parah aduma. So what does it say in the Mishnah? Nofel mishveiferes l'sheikes. What happens if the ashes were not poured or taken in from the tube and put into the trough? Rather, they just fell over into the trough from the shveiferes. Pasul, it's pasul. What do we see from there? That's what it says in the Mishnah, but we can deduce from there that if they fell on their own, then it would be a problem. But if a person would throw would take this shveiferes and pour the contents straight into the water, if the person himself tipped over the contents of the shveiferes into the shoikes, it would be kosher. Asks the Gemara, why would that be true? The pasuk says, "V'lokchu," you have to take latomi for the Tommy person, me'afar sreifas achatos, from the earth, from the ashes of the burnt parah aduma, v'nosan olav ma'im chaim el keli, and you have to take it and put it onto the water. So it says v'lokchu v'nosan, you have to take the ashes and put them on the water. Omar Achmona, the Torah says. And over here, you're not taking the ashes. It's true if they fell over on their own, then there was no v'lokchu, there was no v'nosan. But if the person himself takes this tube of ashes and pours them and empties the contents onto the water, is that called taking and putting? We would have thought that you have to actually take the ashes with your bare hands. V'lokchu, remove the ashes from the from this tube and put it onto the water. It doesn't say that. It says hapiloi, that if you pour the contents of the tube into the trough, it's good enough. But the pasuk says v'lochi v'nosan. Elolav, says Rav, I have proof from here. Shma mino lekicha lididavach shmo lekicha. Taking the ashes via the tube. That means I'm holding the ashes via holding the tube that's containing the ashes is also called a lekicha. Lekicha lididavach is shmo lekicha. And over here the tube is not being tied, it's not mechubar with the ashes inside it. So it's similar to the scarf on a person's hand, and the same way as over there, it's sufficient. So too, says Rava, if you have a scarf around your hand and you take the lulav, you're yetza. Because lekicha lidei davar achir, shmo lekicha. Continues the Gemara, another halacha, v'omar Rabba. Another halacha from Rabba, lo lidoitz inish lulova bohishano. If a person is tied the aravos and the adasim together, he shouldn't push the lulav into that binding of the adasim and the aravos. Dilma nosri tarfo, because when you're doing that, there's a chance it could be that you're going to remove some of the hadasim leaves and some of the aravos leaves. And where are these detached leaves going to be? They're going to be inside this bundle now, between the lulav and the adasim, or between the lulav and the aravos. And they're all going to be together, and then we have an issue that we have a chatzitza. It's considered a chatzitza, because since there's a separation between the three species with these leaves that have been detached, then it's not considered that I'm taking a single lekicha of the three species, because the three species are actually not been bound together, so to speak, because there's something in between them. So that's why Rabbah says, don't do that. Rather, untie the hadassim and aravos and position the hadassim and aravos next to the lulav and then retie them. Rava says there's no issue. Even if you've got some leaves of hadassim and aravos detached in this bundle, it's no problem. Min b'minoi, since it's the same species, hadassim and hadassim leaves, aravos and aravos leaves, it's not considered a separation between the lulav and the hadassim and aravos, and therefore it's okay. We already saw in Amud Aleph that Rabbah may hold min b'minoi is chaytzitz. And that's why Rabbah told the people who were taking care of the lulav of the Resh Kelusa to leave space to hold the lulav. Continues the Gemara of Omar Rabbah, another halacha, lo ilegiz inish lulva bohishano. When you have lulav that's been tied with hadassim and aravos, and it's sticking out at the bottom, and it's longer than you want it. So don't cut off the base of the lulav. Why? Because we know that the lulav leaves are much longer. They are long and they go upwards, which means if you cut a couple of centimeters, a couple of inches at the bottom of the lulav, then the base of the lulav will be cut off. But all those leaves that were attached to that part of the lulav that's now no longer there are now detached lulav leaves that are separating between the hadassim and the lulav, or between the aravos and the lulav. The mishtayri hutza, because there's leaves over some leaves, v'hava chatzitza, and it's going to be a chatzitza. And this is again, Rabbah holds, min b'minoi is a chatzitza. Says the Gemara of Rava Omar. Rava again argued, min b'minoi einei chaytzitz, since the lulav leaves and the lulav are the same species, they do not act as a chatzitza. Continues the Gemara of Omar Rabbah, hadas shel mitzvah. You have hadassim that you're using on sukkahs for the mitzvah of hadas in the lulav. You're not allowed to smell it for the entire duration of the 7 days of Sukkot. And Rashi says we learn this from Sukkah on Daf Tes Amud Aleph. The Gemara says that since the Sukkah has been designated as a mitzvah, Shem Shamayim Chal Al Atzei Sukkah, and therefore one's not allowed to derive personal benefit from it the whole week, since it's been set aside for a mitzvah. So the Rashi explains that Rabbah is saying the same here. The hadassim have been set aside for a mitzvah, don't have any personal benefit and pleasure from them. Esrog shel mitzvah. However, an esrog of that's going to be used, or that is used for the lulav on sukkahs, mutar l'riach bo, you're allowed to smell them. Why? My tama. Hadas, because the hadas, de l'reicha koi. What hadassim are used for typically is to smell them. And therefore, ki aktsei, when you set them aside for the mitzvah, what you actually mean to do is to designate them that they should be used for the mitzvah and not be used for what they are normally used for to smell, and therefore mirecha akte, he separated himself, and he set them aside that they should not be used for smelling. Esrog, however, an esrog de la achilakoi. An esrog is only used to eat, typically the whole year round. You don't smell esrogim, you eat esrogim, and therefore ki akte, when you set an esrog aside to be used for the arba minim with the lulav, then all you're doing is me'achila akse. What you mean to say is, I'm separating it and I'm not going to eat it. But you didn't have in mind, or you're separating it for the mitzvah did not include a separation from smelling them. And obviously, the first thing that comes to mind here is the Gemara we saw before on Daf Lamed Vav Amud Beis, that Rav Chanina ate his esrog. And Tosfos on Daf Mem Vav Amud Beis discusses this a little bit, and you can look there in Tosfos. Continues the Gemara. Va'omar Rabba, another halacha said Rabba, that hadasim b'mechubar. Hadasim, and this has nothing to do with sukkahs now, a regular Shabbos of the whole year. You've got a hadas bush, or hadas tree, a hadas bush, and you've got hadasim that are attached to the ground, attached to the bush. Mutar l'riach b'y, Rabba says you're allowed to smell them on Shabbos. However, an esrog, if you have an esrog tree, and you pass by on Shabbos, you want to smell it, then b'mechubar also l'riach b'y, it's attached to the tree, you're not allowed to smell them on Shabbos. My tama, how would you explain this? Hadasim de l'oriach koi. All you ever do with hadasim is smell them. So, ishariously, if you're going to allow a person to smell the hadasim whilst they're still on the tree, then since it's no problem, it's no effort to smell the hadasim whilst they're on the tree, there's no reason in the world a person should want to cut off the hadasim. What do you want to do with hadasim? Smell them? Smell them on the tree. There's no risk of cutting them on, which is also on Shabbos. However, esrog, what would you normally do with an esrog? The la'achila koi, as we saw before, esrogim are there to be eaten. So ishariously, if you're going to allow him to smell the esrog, oselim igzaya. He may, by mistake, think, I'm going to go to the esrog and smell it. He's got the esrog in his hand. He's going to say, it'll be nice to eat the esrog. He's going to pull it off the tree, and that is also, it's one of the Lamed Tes Melachos to pull anything off a tree, and if he's going to bite the esrog when it's on the tree, is also osur. It's also called toilush, detaching from a tree, and it's osur. And therefore, since a person is susceptible to removing the esrog to eat it, you cannot eat it on the tree. You can eat it off the tree. You can pull it off the tree and eat it, but you cannot use it for eating while still remaining attached to the tree, and therefore don't even go and smell it. But hadasim, you use them to smell, you can continue doing that while on the tree, and therefore it's mutter. Continues the Gemara of Omar Rabba. Another halacha in Hilchas Lulav, Lulav biyamin, the Lulav with hadasim, naravas, you take in the right hand, the esrog, and the esrog b'smoil in the left hand. My tama, why? Hana tlosa mitzvahs, v'ha echoda mitzvah, because in the right hand, I've got 3 mitzvahs, the Lulav, the hadas, and the arava. And in the left hand, I've only got 1, I've only got the esrog. And therefore, we give the 3 mitzvahs into the more prominent hand, the stronger hand, into the right hand. Omar le Rabbi Yirmiyah Zrika. Rabbi Yirmiyah asked Rabbi Zrika, "My tam lo mevorchinon elo al netilas lulav." When you take the lulav, we make a bracha. What bracha do we make? Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvosu v'tzivonu al netilas lulav. Why do we only single out the lulav? What's with the hadasim, naravas, the esrog? The answer is the Gemara. Hoyil ogavoya mikulon. Because the lulav is the most significant, it's the highest of all of them, therefore the entire binding, the entire lulav, the entire igud is called lulav. Asks the Gemara, what are you getting impressed about, that the lulav is protruding, it's higher than all the rest? So lift up the esrog, higher than the lulav, and make a brach on the esrog. So Amalei, he answered him, no. It's not about how high it is off the ground. It's about which is the longest species. The longest of these species is the lulav. A lulav is longer than hadasim and longer than aravas, and certainly longer than the esrog, and therefore you make the bracha on the lulav and not on the other species. Continues the next Mishnah. From somewhere we know that when we use the lulav in order to shake the lulav. Where do we shake it? In Halil. So we all know it because we all know in every sukkah in Shul we shake the lulav. When we take the lulav, we shake the lulav in Halil. So we all know that. But the Mishnah here is taking it for granted that we know that you shake the lulav. And the Gemara is going to ask, who told you have to shake the lulav? And the Gemara is going to remind us of what we saw on Daf Chof Tes Amud Beis. On Chof Tes Amud Beis, where the Gemara discussed the length of the lulav the Mishnah mentioned the extra tefach to be able to shake the lulav above the height of the hadassim and the aravas. So we're going to remember that. And now the Mishnah is going back to that and saying, okay, so you know that you need to shake the lulav. Where in Halil, at what place in Halil do you shake the lulav? That's what the Mishnah is asking. Says the Mishnah, it's going to be Beis Hillel says this, B'hoidu l'Hashem tchila v'soif, in Perek Kuf Yud Ches in Tehillim, where it says once hoidu at the beginning, which is actually the first time we meet hoidu in Halil, and there's another hoidu at the end, which is the last time we meet hoidu in Halil, just before we make the bracha. The end of Halil, so you shake those two hoidus. And also, B'ona Hashem Oishiano, when saying Ona Hashem Oishiano in the middle, also we shake. Divir Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai Imrim, Beis Shammai say, Af B'ona Hashem Atzlichono, also B'ona Hashem Atzlichono. Omer of Ukva, Rabbi Akiva said, Tzaifa Yisi, I was watching Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Yeshua. I was watching these two great sages of Gamliel and Rabbi Yeshua, Shekola Om Hoyu Menanim Es Lulaveim, that all the people, they were shaking their lulav by Ono Hashem Atzlichono, like Beis Shammai. V'heim, but they, Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yeshua, Lo Yinenu Elo Ba'Ono Hashem Ha'ishiano, they followed Beis Hillel, they only shaked by Ono Hashem Ha'ishiano, not by Ono Hashem Hatzlichono. Says the Gemara, Na'anua mandachar shmei, who mentioned shaking a lulav, that you ask, where in Halil do you shake a lulav? Who mentioned shaking the lulav? Says the Gemara, Hosam Koi is going back on that Mishnah on Chof Tes Amud Beis. Over there it says, Kol lulav sheyesh bo shloisha tvachim, a lulav that has 3 tvachim, kedei lenanea bo, an extra tefach on top, the 4th tefach with which to do the shaking. Kosher, that's a kosher lulav. And now the Mishnah here is saying, Heichon menanin, where in Halil do you do the nanua? Says the Gemara, Tanan Hosam, we learned in a Mishnah in Masechet Menachos, and this is talking about the waving of the Shtei HaLechem and the 2 lambs on Shavuos. They would bring 2 breads, or it would be part of, they wouldn't put it onto the Mizbeach, but there would be a korban called Shtei HaLechem that would accompany the 2 lambs, which would be brought as a korban, and they would be woven, one would wave them around. So the Mishnah says, Shtei HaLechem u'shnei kivsei atzeres, keitzat u'oisa. How would he do it? Says the Mishnah, Maniach Shtei HaLechem al gabe shtei akvosim. He takes the 2 breads and puts them on top of the 2 lambs. U'maniach yodei tachtei, and he puts his hand under the 2 lambs. U'meinif, and he waves them. U'meilech u'meivi, which means that he moves it away from him and back towards himself. Maila u'meirid, and he lifts them up and lowers them down again. Shneimar, as it says in the pasuk, V'kidash to'ez chazei atnufa ve'ez sheika truma asher hunaf v'asher huram. It mentions there the hunaf, which is the waving, and the huram, which is the lifting. Me'ela miluim, and there it's actually talking about the parts of the avodah of the miluim, not talking about the Shtei HaLechem and the kivsei atzeres, but in other places in Shas, and Rashi brings it here, we learn that all the tnufos, all the wavings that are all done in a similar fashion. So from that pasuk we see there's a concept called hunaf, which is waving, and there's a concept called huram. Hunaf means meilech or mevi, waving it away from yourself and back to yourself. Huram means lifting, and obviously when you lift, you lower. So that is what they would do with the Shtei HaLechem and the Kivsei Atzeres. Omer Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan now explains why would they do this. Because when you wave something back, away from yourself and towards yourself, then, and they would do this to all 4 sides, then they would do this in order to show that the mitzvah that they're doing of bringing the korban, the Shtei HaLechem and the Kivsei Atzeres, they're doing it for who? For Hashem. And Hashem, He is the master of the winds, and the winds are on all 4 sides. The reason that we would lift it up and down is Lemisha Hashemayim V'Oretz Sheloi, to show that we're doing this mitzvah for the sake of Hashem, who the heaven, which is what we allude to when we lift it, the Shemayim, and the Oretz is down, that the heaven and the earth belongs to Him. Sheloi is His. But Marova Masnuhacha, in Eretz Yisrael they would say as follows, Om Reb Choma Bar Ukva, Om Reb Yosi Bar Chanina, Meilech u'Meivi, they would wave it away from themselves and towards themselves, in order to stop, in order to be protected from those bad winds, from those winds that are dangerous or that are not good for us, Milo Moirid, and we lift it and lower it, Kedei Later Tlolim Roim, the dew, or the more accurately probably means the rains, that those rains that are not good for us, to stop them. That's what they would, that's what the Shtei Alechem and the Kivsei Atzeres, that's why they were woven and lifted. Omer Rabbi Yosi bar Ovin v'Teimer Rabbi Yosi bar Zavila. Zoisei Meres. It's an amazing thing. What do we see from here? We see that shiori mitzvah, even the part of the mitzvah that's not an integral part of the mitzvah, it's not an essential part of the mitzvah. And we learned in Yom Daf Hey explicitly that the waving and the lifting of the Shtei Alechem and the Kivsei Atzeres, they do not, it's not essential. And if you don't do them, you'll still get atoned. The korban will still fulfill its purpose. Nonetheless, even though it's just a side part, so to speak, a leftover part of the mitzvah, it's the part of the mitzvah that's not the main part of the mitzvah, nonetheless, ma'akvenis hapuronos, it can stop and protect us from bad things happening to us. Shahari tnufa, because this waving and lifting of the Shtei Alechem and the Kivsei Atzeres, shiori mitzvah, it's not ma'akav, it's not essential. Nonetheless, nonetheless, they can stop the winds and the rains from hurting us. So that's as far as the Shtei Alechem, the Kivsei Atzeres. V'omar Rava. Rava said, V'chein belulav. Lulav also, that when we mananea them moilich or mevi, away from us and towards us and up and down. Rav Acha bar Yaakov, mamtila u'maisilei. Rav Acha bar Yaakov, he would do exactly that. He would be moilich, he would extend the lulav away from himself and then back towards himself. And that's the mamti u'maisi. And Omar, and he would say, that Dain Gira Be'ene de Sitna. This lulav that I'm waving here, this is an arrow in the eyes of the Satan. Because it's showing the Satan, you couldn't even stop us from accepting the yoke of Torah, the yoke of mitzvahs. Here we are, we're doing these mitzvahs, look how we're doing the mitzvahs, and it's an arrow in the eyes of the Satan. V'lav miltzi. However, the Gemara says it's not appropriate to actually verbalize such a thing, mishum de'osi le'igurebe, because you're provoking the Yetzer Hara, and that's not such a good idea. And when it says here, v'chein belulav, Rashi just mentions here, moilech mevi mailo moirid, that the lulav also, we do these movements with the lulav as we know the nanuim, but Rashi in a couple of places mentions that the reason, or that we shake the lulav round, or what it alludes to, is, as we saw before, that it's latzei ruchos rois and tlolim roim, that it protects us from all those negative influences in the world, from the winds that could hurt us, and from the rains that could harm us. And in Mirz Hashem, in the next shiur, we're going to learn the next Mishnah.